before I start with the introduction, okay? Okay, so we are live. Welcome to my digital talk. Today I have two guests, Marko and Nicholas Glinsman. Both are geopolitical and geoeconomic experts. Nicholas is also macro specialist. And our topic today is global macro outlook. It's quite of a broad topic. That's why I would like to immediately start with a direct question to both of you, which is, what is your assessment and anticipation about the global macro outlook following the COVID-19 pandemic? What are your main expectations now for the second half of the year? I think we start first with Albert, and then we move to Nick, and we will rotate our guests following the questions.
Well, thank you, Velina. Concerning the global economy after COVID, it's difficult because you need to define, after COVID, because personally, I don't think that COVID's just gonna be out of the headlines or out of the politicians' mouths in the next 12 to 18 months, to be honest with you, specifically because the global economy is still reeling from supply chain disruptions, fiscal policies, political policies that have gone bad and created doom loops. So, I just don't think that we're just going to be away from COVID in the near term. I know for the summer, the Europeans and even the Americans and Canadians, they decided to open because you can't keep people locked up for the summer. But once the flu season starts, my fear is that COVID again is going to resurge in the politicians' mouths and probably take a little bit of a hit on the global economy on the second half of the year.
Mm-hmm.
I don't disagree. Thanks, Velina. I don't disagree with that at all. And I think that you will tend to find that more in those economies or regions where there are still problems economically and probably with the supply chains. COVID is a wonderful excuse, one for maintaining certain higher levels of control in the population, but it's also a wonderful excuse for excusing policy error. And, from wearing an economics hat, your first question was, what are nightmares? My nightmares are basically policy error, inflation, and inflation. So it's a combination of that. And hence, we have that mix of politics and economics. And I think Albert, I always work from the basis, when the US sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold. That's an economic and market saying. And I think, Albert's point on doom loop is just a great way of starting. That's a reintroduction of Albert, because he phrased it earlier so beautifully that we can mix the politics and the economics perfectly in this discussion. The phrase was?
Well, the Biden administration and honestly even most of the EU, they want to make the politics work, but they also need the economics to work. But the problem is, because they counter each other most of the time, that they create a doom loop, right? Like, specifically if you look at the unemployment rate, which was a big miss in the United States, you have the Biden administration that wants to keep these unemployment benefits going because, realistically, that just pays people to vote for them. But on the back end, it's causing businesses to not have workers, which is reducing the demand side of the economy, which stops any kind of recovery effort going forward. So that's what the problem.
That's where I end up starting to agree with Larry Summers, which is something I thought I would never do in my professional life. Because Albert and I were talking during 2 Fridays ago, the unemployment data, and it came out, and Albert was going, oh my God, that's a huge miss. I wasn't looking at the unemployment or the non-farm payroll. I was looking at the average hourly earnings, because for a year we've been talking about inflation due to supply chain. Now, that came out hugely higher. That was a shock. That was an equivalent shock higher as per the CPI and PPI that came out this week. And I worry that, going back to the doom loop concept that Albert just introduced, politics of paying people unemployment benefit, UE, universal basic income, so on and so forth. We shouldn't forget that historically, where there has been a real inflation problem, it's been a combination of fiscal dominance, mid-1960s with LBJ, Great Society, that is the equivalent of what we're getting for infrastructure, which I call the Green Gods Plan, and the war expenditure on Vietnam, that's the COVID expenditure. So we've got, but this is all on steroids currently today. Now, combine that with the fact that we have an administration that is very pro-union. Now, back in the mid-60s to the 70s, we got, particularly in the UK, as a great example, you had wage pull in extremis because Labour was so unionized. And I think that's where you've got a bit of a political economic doom loop. You can see the power of the unions in the US already with the teachers' union reluctance to go back to school, despite it being a political talking point on both sides of the aisle. So that worries me. That's what my nightmare is the inflation, and it's all building up.
So maybe just to interrupt shortly before we move to concrete examples such as the US economy. So we have the on the one side the developed economies, but then we have also a kind of a dichotomy between the developed economies and emerging markets as well. Maybe this is also something that we should touch upon shortly. But let me just ask a follow-up question, which is: do you actually share the optimistic prognosis of some of the global institutions that we are going to witness positive so growth, economic growth, global economic growth? We've seen the analysis of the International Monetary Funds and other actually analytical organizations, and actually they say we are going to witness now quite of a economic growth. Do you share this actually? Because what you actually pointed out is going in the other direction, more in this doomsday outlook. So we have a kind of a conflict, I think, also in the expectations and in the anticipations. On the one side, the dividing line between politics and economics, as Albert pointed out, and on the other side, also some very worrisome indicators, as Nick pointed out, as regards inflation, for instance.
Well, it's all relative. We've got to think about real growth, i.e., GDP growth net of inflation. And last year we were talking about the roaring 20s, but I worry about that was with a different political outlook. Now we went through the election cycle at the end of last year, and I worry about this government interference and the fiscal dominance weighing down on the upside for the economic growth. And we always have to take these IMF and OECD forecasts somewhat with a pinch of salt. They've been, only until recently they were still negative UK and expecting the UK to underperform Argentina. Well, all evidence pointed a completely different. And now there's expectations the UK could be number one in the G7. But the interesting aspect of it is we've got this new fiscal dominance, and we all know that pushing on a string. You spend more, the government spends more, it pushes on the string. It's not the world's greatest allocator of resources. And that could hold us back, plus also the inflation side. But we are just going to get, you take these forecasts, of course we were going to snap back. But are we going to go above pre-COVID economic output? Mm-hmm. UK is now forecast potentially sometime next year. I think likewise the US. But EU, if they miss another summer, it's going to be really problematic, particularly for the Mediterranean countries. Albert, I interrupted.
Yeah, that's
Albert,
okay. I mean,
what's your
you know,
take?
well, going back to like the growth rates that the IMF and whatever three-letter institution you want to put out there, we're coming out from COVID, so they're saying, oh, our growth is 6% or 9% or whatever number that they throw out there. But these are, I mean, you're coming back from zero almost, so they're not real numbers, right? And then they calculate inflation without really taking into account food and energy inflation on top of that, because we had 4.2% inflation in the United States. Realistically, that's almost 9% if you take those things into account. That's stunning, right? And as Nick has been pointing out about wage inflation, I mean, you have to have companies are starting to pay people to even get interviews and raising wages 10-15%. Well, that's going to trickle down into every single product that comes onto the market, and with demand rising for somewhat of a reopening or somewhat of a recovery. But I don't see unemployment coming down from double digits for the next 12 months. So these growth rates, compared to pre-COVID, I think they're just fantasy that they're talking right now, just basically to give politicians cover at the moment.
I think one of the nightmares I have, Velina, is I think the central banks have got themselves into such a corner, and if inflation goes as far, my view on inflation is we could have some really scary numbers over the next 6 months, and then ultimately, as certain effects come out, we will settle down at an inflation rate in the US of between 3 and 4%. Remember that target area, slightly above or below for the Fed, is 2%. What's the Fed going to do? And I've got this sense that at some point they are going to have to reintroduce the idea. Back in the 60s and 70s, we had boom bust with Volcker and other central bankers. I'm not suggesting people can't take bust anymore in the current world. It's not somewhere where you can hide from a microaggression. That would be quite a big aggression. But I think they're going to have to start to accept volatility of economic output, even with certain quarters slowing down to negative for a while and then coming back, because otherwise inflation is going to go out of control. And it's less, I mean, the Americans are, as a population, not used to inflation, but it's less important for the Americans because it is the reserve currency. It will flow through to Europe, won't be excluded. Emerging markets, if the interest rate market goes crazy in the US, that's the end of emerging market policy making. So, this is why I say when the US sneezes, the rest of the world catches the cold. Actually, emerging markets will catch severe bronchitis, if not pneumonia, by
almost COVID, you could say.
Yeah, I was on that path.
And it's obvious that it's no longer just about politics and economics, but now you've named it. It's also about the fiscal policy of specifically of central banks, so using monetary actual instruments to stimulate global economy. So do you think that this kind of trend will continue following the COVID-19? And what is actually the exit of from this kind of policy? I mean, in the long run, because it's more or less obvious that it's an experiment that hasn't been actually tried before. You nicknamed several times the 60s, the 70s, but we didn't have quantitative easing during the 60s and the 70s. And actually, what will be the opt-out strategy of the central banks?
Yeah, but so although you point out that we didn't have quantitative easing, we had other instruments like price controls back in the 60s and 70s, right? You
and
can't
fixed exchange rates as well.
Yeah, and fixed
until
exchange
71.
rates. Yeah, so implementing price controls right now to combat inflation would be an absolute beautiful thing for the politics of the Biden administration, but the reality is those would be a nightmare to roll back. I mean, I discussed this with Harold actually on the phone maybe about a week and a half ago, trying to determine what was correlating between the 60s and 70s and today, and he said price controls, inept leadership is one of the other biggest problems. So I mean, how do they exit out of this? I mean, how do you separate the central bank's fiscal policy and monetary policies versus politics? Because realistically, those Fed chairs and central bank chairs are political appointees serving at the behest of whoever appointed them, right? So after
and
we
becoming
have
more politicized, right?
More politicized. I mean, the myth or the fantasy that the central banks are independent from the political positions is just ludicrous to me. It's just absolutely crazy. Jerome Powell is most likely going to take blame for an upcoming correction in the market in the fall because he's a Trump guy. Who do they replace that with? Most likely Brainard, which is one of the things that keeps me up at night.
Yeah, that would be full-blown MMT. That would be the ultimate experiment.
And maybe let's put some hierarchy to the issue, because this is, I think, also important. If we talk about central banks, there is one specific central bank, and the rest is a function of it, right? So it's about the Federal Reserve. And if we speak about global reserve currency, there is one global reserve currency, which is, as we know, still possible because of the global power projection capabilities of one sole systemic power, which is the United States, which actually still controls all these interconnected flows of goods, of services, of capital, of meanwhile data, right? And it basically is more or less still about US dominated or US controlled maritime routes, supply chains, transport routes and networks that actually enable these flows.
Of course.
And
that's what
I think this is an important clarification, because often we are witnesses of conversations that actually do not make make this clarification, which is actually that if you don't understand the hierarchy of the processes, which leads to what and which is a function of what, I think it somehow actually does not do service to the logic of the conclusions.
There's one other aspect of the dollar reserve currency and any reserve currency is the US's comfort with running deficits. Without a deficit, you can't have a reserve currency. This is the fallacy behind anybody that argues the renminbi will be a reserve currency. They don't want to run deficits. They like their surpluses. This is why the euro failed to challenge the US dollar, because with mercantilist Germany, all deficits are not acceptable. So you got to. That's key as well, and people forget that is one of the issues behind. Sorry.
Isn't it also that the euro cannot challenge the dollar because it's a function of the dollar, it's a function of the euro-dollar system, which means that actually the euro is a product of the dollar-based monetary system.
Yeah,
so,
of course, Velina, that's absolutely you explained it absolutely perfectly. There's no better explanation about why the United States dollar is the reserve currency and will be the reserve currency for the remainder of our lifetimes. You have the Fed, you have the Anglosphere banks, and everything else that branches out of there. Every single country needs dollars in reserve to make sure that their country doesn't go into hyperinflation. And people forget about this. They think that because the United States has $21 trillion in debt that we can experience hyperinflation, but that's not accurate, because currencies are paired trades. What are we going to hyperinflate against? Ourselves? We can print $20 trillion tomorrow and service all the debt that we own to ourselves.
Because everything's priced in dollars.
Of course.
Right? That's it. Whereas, if you go back to people say, there's a Weimarization of the US. No, there isn't, because nothing was priced in Reichmarks.
No, that was also in a time of multipolarity with nations on equal military footing. That does not exist today. They're not even close.
Right. Exactly.
Which of course means that if there is another global, or let's say if there is another state actor that seeks to act globally, it will need the facilitation of its own networks, be it monetary, financial, capital networks, and then of course its own connectivities, its own transport routes to basically make sure that the flow of goods, of services and so on is secured along these supply chains.
That's exactly right. I mean, you grew up in the Soviet ecosphere. The Soviet Union had Budapest as its financial center, and then it branched out into its Soviet-influenced world. That was the only challenger at that time, and they imploded.
And Soviet Union was not entangled within the US led networks. That's very important. Actually, that's very important argument that often analysts forget. If the collapse of the Soviet Union did not bring about a major systemic crisis to the global system. No, it actually led to a crisis, political, economic one, within the Soviet bloc, because the countries which were interconnected within the Soviet Union were dependent on the center. And of course, they were left behind from one day to the next. But it didn't result in a global system crash.
Yeah, and it's actually quite comical to me, because the creation of the Eurodollar actually was initiated by the Soviet Union, because they didn't trust their own currency, and they wanted to take dollars out of the United States for fear of being confiscated or frozen. So they took dollars and put them in Budapest, therefore creating the Eurodollar.
Oh, it was of course no secret that everyone was stockpiling dollars actually during the Soviet times, and once the countries were experiencing hyperinflation situation, the black market was actually flooded not by other currencies but by dollars. But let's this was now an interesting deviation, and I think a necessary clarification. Let's go back to 2021. Now, given your anticipation for the American and British and the European Union economies, what are actually the three most important geoeconomic, you can also add, if you like, geopolitical signals that keep you actually awake at night?
Inflation, the US sneezing, and the rest of the world catching a cold, verging on pneumonia at the margins in EM, and policy error. Now, the interesting thing, this takes us back to something we just mentioned, and Albert will fill in the holes that I leave. But we've made a lot of noise about Anglosphere, and they are still. So we're fully aware that there are regular conversations. I think it's bi-weekly, every 2 weeks, Albert?
Yeah.
Between the Anglosphere central banks. Now, the Anglosphere central banks, it won't be necessary. I mean, obviously there's talks between the various chairs and governors, but this is at a working level, the market teams and the economics teams. And their great fear is inflation, particularly commodity inflation. So there has been, and we called it about 2.5 months ago, a desire for the Anglospheric banks, central banks, to start tapering and then tightening. Now, when that includes the Fed, I suspect the Fed in August at Jackson Hole starts to talk about the taper. And it's an easy taper. They can stop buying mortgage-backed securities, given the state of the housing market in the US, right? But we've had the Bank of Canada taper. We've had the UK taper. Noises that the RBA in Australia would like to taper. New Zealand's an outlier. Now, occasionally who joins these conversations, from what I've been told, is the Bank of Japan. They're all watching signals on inflation. So that keeps them up at night. Okay. And I suspect that those parts of the various central banks are the monetarist parts. So they're also concerned about fiscal dominance as well. And I think beautifully expressed by Larry Summers, Bill Dudley, ex-head of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. All this inflation is coming much faster than they were worried about. So I think Mohamed El-Erian, who was someone that writes well, manages poorly, I suspect. But his writing recently, he was talking about maybe the Fed has to shift its view. And this goes back to the idea it's all led by the Fed. But I would watch what's going on in the UK, because I've often said politically the UK leads the US in terms of big trends. So you've just had that big trend in the UK where basically the Conservative Party is now the working people's party, and the Labour Party is the party of the elites. From a Bank of England point of view, they've started to taper. They are coming out with, Andrew Haldane, who's retiring as chief economist, had this coiled spring look at the UK economy. And it certainly looks like it's going to be a coiled spring. We suspect that the Bank of England are already, NOPE is forgotten, even if it's in the toolbox, but is making enough noise to say, look, we know tapering is coming, and we know the end of QE is coming. Next step is, when's there going to be a rate rise because of inflation? Mm-hmm. Our anticipation is second half of next year, first rate rise in the UK. Mm-hmm. It'll be an interesting, that's a good bank, given the Fed and the UK and the Bank of England work very closely together, to see what happens with central bank policy in the Anglo-Saxon countries. What does that mean for Europe? This is where my nightmare comes, the ECB. We know that without the ECB, Italy is in default. We know that the pressures are there on the fiscal front. I would also suggest that the EU will firm up the Stability Pact, because there is not and will not be enough MPs in the Bundestag in Germany to vote through and enter the fiscal debt brake, because you need 2/3 majority. It's not going to happen. The only two parties that support that are the Greens and the Linke. The SPD, Schultz came out last week and said we've got to start looking at the fiscal debt brake and bringing that back in. So if that's the case, you've got all these, even France has got a debt issue now. So the big danger for Europe, and this is going to be really problematic, is when does the ECB stop the QE? Because then who's going to finance the profligate southern states, including, I would say, France? And what I'm hearing there, and this is the big problem, and they're not involved in these calls with the Anglo-Saxon Central Bank, is you've got the frugal representatives, obviously Biden, but you have not the Dutch ECB member, the Finnish ECB member. You can go through the usual suspects. They would like QE to end sooner than the others. There'll be an agreement with the monetary policy review that QE, the PEP, will carry on to a certain date. But it's a date, and that's the price that Lagarde and the Doves are going to have to pay to the hawks, is to set a firm date. Otherwise, you're going to get a split council. And a split council, you can imagine the turmoil of a split council on the European markets. The other thing that the Europeans have got as a problem is, as we go through this process, they will realize that they need London as a financial center way more than they politically state. This is that political doom loop. You're not going to have finance. We're not going to give you equivalents. Oh, we need them. Equivalents will suddenly come. So there's one of my nightmares, and I'm going to hand that over to Albert to disinterpret.
Albert, yes. What keeps you awake? Does something keep you awake in the night?
Well, obviously, we've already gone over inflation multiple times, but food inflation is one of my big things of what to worry about, but also how that relates to the Chinese and Indian competition, competition for water, competition for food. I mean, the Chinese are in a protein shortage. The Asian flu for hogs has been stepping up. They have to fish. They fish unbelievably and illegally globally in the South China Seas. They go into Madagascar. The Indians are not going to take lightly to that. The Philippines are not going to take lightly to that. My concern is, if the Chinese get desperate, do they have skirmishes on the open seas, which would then affect shipping, disrupting shipping, creating more inflation down the road in the emerging markets? I mean, that's one of my bigger fears. On top of that, it would be mismanagement or just bad foreign policy by the Biden administration, trying to interfere or trying to solve issues where, ideologically they're just not on the right side. I mean, we just look at the Middle East now. All of a sudden, the Middle East is completely exploded. I mean,
North Korea also, the signals
Korea.
coming from North Korea. I mean, these are obviously two signals, very important geopolitical signals that things are once again on fire.
Yeah, and this in my view, this is completely beneficial for the Russians while they move into Africa and solidify their natural resources. And in Latin America, the Chinese are having problems with food security, getting desperate in the Indian Ocean. The Biden administration is mismanaging the Middle East. So we're gonna be looking at food inflation, energy inflation, just continuing on into 2022. In my opinion, that's what's keeping me up at night. What the nightmare scenarios are.
Well, based on your scenario about the surging food prices, are we going to witness a similar scenario with the Arab Spring in 2011 when we had this immense surge of food prices? Do you think that because right now the Mediterranean is obviously one of these regions where you have multiple regional actors, constellations, various conflicting interests, and based on geoeconomics and geopolitics. Even the European Union member states are not on the same page and are actually witnessing, so basically joining various blocs. Just to give one example with Libya, do you think that this might result in this kind of similar scenario?
Absolutely. I mean, the worst thing that could happen to politicians in the political system is inflation in food and energy, especially food. You're looking at emerging markets with already a food problem. I mean, America is the breadbasket of the world, and parts of Russia and with wheat and whatnot. But I mean, if you start going down the ladder to these emerging markets in Africa or Latin America, well, Latin America not so much, but Africa and India and the Central Asia, you're going to have problems. You starve people and people are going to riot immediately. So I do see if food inflation does get out of hand, I could see some African nations start to rise up and cause problems.
Is that a risk, sociological risk for the CCP in China? Because there was this... yesterday I tweeted that article about the primary Chinese organization for disseminating agricultural data has gone offline.
Of course it's a problem. Of course it's a problem. It's one over 1 billion people that are like protein. They're hungry people. They're protein hungry, and they're struggling right now. Velina, you had a gentleman, a Huntsman, on, that talked about supply chains.
Yes, we talked about supply chains. Yeah,
and he's a stand-up guy. I really like him. But he's the one that touches on food security along with me for the longest time. Like, China's food insecurity is a problem. It is a festering problem that could undermine the entire CCP hierarchy at some point.
Well, I think the majority does not realize that when it comes to China, it's not so much about global power projection in first place, but rather a facilitation of political power within the borders of China, how to actually keep this population that is witnessing, I don't know how countless times per year, riots or any kind of natural catastrophes or whatsoever, how to keep this population actually under control and how to actually prevent any instabilities, domestic instabilities. And this is actually what Xi Jinping is going to be certainly dealing with, right? Following now the post-COVID-19 recovery.
Yeah, we have to understand that Xi is there at the behest of certain elite families, and he is there to serve those interests first. If he violates their interests, if there's enough families in Guangdong or other provinces that want him out, he will be out. As simple as that. And people have this misconception that he is a dictator and all powerful. Well, I mean, to a degree, but that's because he has a network of elite families doing that for him. Initially, he had Wang Qishan as an enforcer. I don't know who the new guy, I forgot the new guy's name, it escapes me at the moment, but now he's got a new guy that's an enforcer, and he has to keep these people in line. You know how that is back in the old Eastern Bloc. Keeping the elite in line is always going to be a failed prospect. They'll eventually replace them with somebody.
Well, we've witnessed a lot of people being imprisoned or actually sentenced to death from the political elites, communist elites, due to corruption. But in fact, we know that most of them were also opponents of Xi Jinping. So actually, this is the way how, the circles around him will probably be further facilitated. And once again, we also witnessed during the escalation phase between Russia and Ukraine that just coincidentally, during exactly this period, Putin, the Russian President Putin, also managed to sign a law allowing him now to run for further 2 mandates. So basically, we see that on that side there is a certain effort to, to facilitate, to consolidate political power. But
But Putin has his own succession. He has problems too because he has succession problems. They have the oligarchs that support him, Sechin, Timchenko, and maybe half a dozen other ones. They have offspring that they have aspirations to be leader of Russia for their own personal aspirations. So what's going to happen when those circles start to conflict and they see that there's a succession problem in Moscow? That's going to be bloody, and I don't think anybody looks at that yet.
Historically, it's always bloody in Moscow. Absolutely.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, but I think I claim that still the directions of foreign security and defense policy won't change much, no matter who is actually in power. So even if you take an opposite leader as Navalny, if he would manage, which of course is a very unrealistic scenario, but let's think about it for a second, even he would actually be in favor of annexation of Crimea and certain foreign and security policy choices that Russia made. And this is something that I think often is neglected in Western analysis.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's the old history of Russia, isn't it? Even Tsarist Russia was insecure, so they kept increasing the borders and increasing the size of the country. So that's a historical, there's your history repeating. I mean, I was just listening to the two of you there, and I'm sitting here thinking two things. One, within China itself, it is a sclerotic regime that is fragile. People don't realize there is a fragility to the regime. Food inflation could be the spark that sets it alight. But there's an interesting, and this is your area actually, Velina. Back to commodities, we've got everything's green. Even the central banks are promoting green, which is that crossover to politics. I mean, I don't know what a central bank can do to impose green on an economy, but the need for green and environmental products puts certain countries with large deposits of rare earths and the things such as cobalt, lithium, etc., strategically important. Well, there's one that could cause a real problem between the Russians and the Chinese, which is Afghanistan, over and above Africa, which is problematic too. Mm-hmm. And I actually, back to the inflation nightmare, this whole emphasis on green from the EU Recovery Fund, Biden administration, everybody, that is inflationary. Those costs are coming down to the end consumer. And that's where I find inflation and politics crossover beautifully. It's a beautiful crossover. But I think that actually can create some hotspots geopolitically. Would I be right there, Albert?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think the Chinese actually realized this because I believe recently they were not in favor of the United States leaving because the United States gives the Chinese trade free security within Afghanistan. Now, for them to step into Afghanistan, I mean, that's a joke. They can't even step into certain areas of Africa without the Russians. So what makes them think they're going to go into Afghanistan, which is exponentially more difficult to control?
And speaking of greening the global economy, that's also interesting because I think it's going to be linked to another trigger that you've mentioned already, reconfiguration of supply chains. Because if you are dependent on certain rare earths and minerals, and you want to actually green your economy, but how is this going to happen if you actually will increase these dependencies? And we know also that the reconfiguration will take time, will take a lot of time. It's technically a very complex process. It's not going to happen in 1 or 2 years. So it's
an inflationary process.
It's inflationary. So that means that on the one side, developed economies want to spend trillions of dollars, euros, or whatsoever in greening the economy, so decarbonizing their economies, without actually securing these global supply chains, without actually deviating from China and other dependencies, without having the necessary rare earths and minerals. And I think that this is a kind of a construct, more or less, kind of a wishful thinking that conflicts reality and realpolitik. So actually you increase dependencies.
Interestingly enough, on the rare earth side of things, it's not that countries in the West don't have access to rare earths. They do. It's that 80% of global refining of rare earths, which is incredibly environmentally unfriendly.
That's the point. Yeah,
is in China.
It's a dirty business. Nobody wants to do it.
We've had, if you go back over the last 5 years, we've been talking about decoupling, right? COVID is the ultimate decoupling. Mm-hmm. It speeded everything up. It is effectively, COVID did for decoupling what social media has done to news. Headline out, and with all the impacts and negative impacts and positive. So COVID has created the decoupling momentum at hyperspeed to what people were planning for, but you are now seeing certain Western countries. I think the area that's most exposed to decoupling and lack of access is going to be Europe again, because if you look at here's a great allegory here. Europe is governed by the precautionary principle. That's what affected Europe's uptake, the EU's uptake on the AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson. It's the precautionary principle. They won't take the risk. Whereas in the Anglosphere, you have the innovation principle, where innovation is a risk. So that precautionary principle will slow down any effort for the EU to become independent on the refinery of rare earths. They may have access to rare earths, but it's the refinery that's key. Mm-hmm. So that's a crucial differentiator. And that's why, I speak for Albert, I may be wrong here, Albert, myself, Harold as well. That's why we think the reconfiguration is going to be led by the Anglosphere, where the innovation principle prevails, and in fact Schumpeter's creative destruction is in action, effectively. So I think the green side will be led, and also the other thing that we have to figure out in decoupling is you can't buy the solar panels from China. So where are they going to be made? Mm-hmm. So there has to. I mean, I'm pro-environment. I just think the economics of things like the Green Goals Plan just misses a lot of the proper processes that need to go through. So it'll be interesting to see.
Yeah, sorry, I agree, Nick. No, I agree. And going back to what Velina said is reconfiguring of supply chains, creating other issues, systemic issues. Again, that's just another doom loop that they're creating for themselves. They want the politics to work, but they don't want the economics to have to do it. So it's problematic.
And in fact, the infrastructure includes the legislative infrastructure, which is again where I think the Anglosphere prevail under common law versus codified law, Roman law. It's more hostile to a creative destruction phase and reconfiguration. So I think that's where you'll see that this is why, my view is the Anglospheric countries will lead, and the EU, for example, will you can see it already, is making that choice to veer towards the Anglosphere, because you know, the pushback against China is increasing. I mean, this news over the last week on China threatening Sweden and Ericsson. So, I mean, you know, these wolf warriors are creating friction that's not working, and the vaccine diplomacy is failing too. So,
yeah,
I think we're headed in.
The reaction was, by the way, what you mentioned about Chinese activities in Europe, within the European member states, is that now the investment deal was put on hold, and what this led actually to the unprecedented agreement on starting negotiations, or actually restarting the negotiations, which were put on hold in 2013 between the European Union and India. And right now there are negotiations on a free trade agreement, which is actually higher as compared to the investment deal. And this is, even if it's a symbolic, I think this is very important to understand how actually these Chinese activities led to the opposite of what they were intending.
Yeah, because I mean, just quickly, sorry, Albert, and I'll leave it to you afterwards. You're right. Moving away from China towards India is definitely a dynamic within the EU. I still think they're UK, you know, they're completely there's something about Brexit. So the UK announcing its deal with India, I was sitting there waiting. Oh, okay, so there's a problem with the China deal. Watch how the EU will reignite the India deal, because the UK's just done a deal. So that's why I think the Anglosphere, either by intent or default, does do some leading, or a lot of leading. Over to you, Albert. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, no, that's completely correct. I mean, I think India is the key to both the EU and the United States of decoupling from the Chinese as much as possible. Let's be realistic. You can't decouple everything from the Chinese. It's just impossible. But, you know, going back to the trade deal with that's failing with the Chinese and the EU, I mean, the Chinese only rely on intimidation, no matter where. That's the only thing that they have, and that's the only thing that's ever worked for them in the emerging markets. You cannot treat the European Union as an emerging market. They're much more sophisticated. They have much more resources, and they have actual, you know, stable societies that they can't be fractured by Chinese intervention. It just doesn't work. And you're seeing this now. I mean, the EU is finally, you know, after long years of calls from the United States and other nations to hit back at China, they're talking about the tension of minorities in China, the climate policies that China violates on a daily basis every single year, which is, you know, unbelievable that nobody's talked about that beforehand. So, I mean, the EU is doing the proper things. Go to India, tag along with the Anglosphere, you know, stick with the supply chains and the security of the U.S. dollar, and, you know, advance in that way. Advance the Eastern Europe is open for business, for God's sakes. You know, advance that. I mean, you have plenty of chances in Albania, Bulgaria, Romania, you know, southern Italy, parts of Spain, that they need development. You know, you don't need to sit there and try to chase the Chinese for a few bucks, you know, just because they're buying a lot of Mercedes for Germany.
That's interesting point, Albert, because I was just told last week that, for instance, the industry in Mumbai, they would seek further relations with UK and the Anglosphere, because this is the world they always known. They don't know the European Union and the member states. They want actually, this is what I was told, they would like actually to expand to Central and Eastern Europe, because they know that this is a region that is going to experience a lot of growth, but they don't know how. They don't know the actors. They don't understand the system there. So I think that this is one way how actually connectors might help to, you know, to a little bit merge the gap. And there is also interesting question now linked to India, and I'm seeing the chat room, and there are so many questions. I would like to cover some of them, or as many as possible. There is a comment about India that it doesn't have the infrastructure to scale at capacities to serve the world. Do you think that this might be one way how actually the Anglosphere and the European Union might merge? That means, of course, how to decouple away from China in the Indo-Pacific region to facilitate actually a Western connectivity infrastructure and supply chains.
Well, Velina, you and I discussed this, I believe, a year and a half ago, maybe even more, of how how I was completely disappointed with the European Union of why they didn't have their own BRI style network overseas connecting India and even the Caribbean and Latin America, or even parts of Africa. They have the overseas networks, the historical networks. I don't want to hear about colonialism back in the 50s and 60s. That's just ludicrous at this point, right? The European Union should have gotten together and they should have made a BRI style competitor to the Chinese, what the Chinese were doing, specifically in India and other emerging markets. The problem becomes competition between the French, the Germans, and other states that they want a bigger slice than they're being negotiated with. Who's gonna supply the money? Who's gonna get the contracts? Who's gonna supply the military component? Because you need the military component to secure infrastructure in those regions. What they should have done, they should have piggybacked with the United States and said, "Hey, we got to come together and do this." But again, policy, local.
And who is going to capitalize? Because these are long-term projects. That means once you start investing, once you start building up, there is going to be another politician who is going to capitalize on the outcome, because it takes more than 4 years to build an infrastructure.
That's the cost. Don't you think this is actually, everybody talks about the Brexit cost to the UK. This is actually one of the Brexit costs to the EU. That's exactly what it is, because people forget. And again, I'm like Albert. I don't want to talk about empire or colonialism or any of that nonsense. I'm looking forward. Get over it. Get over. We've got to look forward with positivity. Get over all the negativity. It doesn't serve anybody except retrograde. But there is an example already going on for competition with the BRI, led by Japan, backed up by Australia and the US. Yeah. Now that's in the Far East, but that's a start. And remember, if you think about Japan strategically, they have a desire to join the Five Eyes. You've got the Quad, but Japan has a desire to join the Five Eyes. So that tells me, and in fact, my information is that the US was working very closely with Japan in terms of offering alternative to the BRI. And that alternative actually also included the necessary legal advice to extricate some of these emerging market countries from the debt obligations with the Chinese. Note that one of the things that's been a problem with the Paris Club or the IMF debt renegotiations is these Chinese obligations and the fact that the Chinese don't want to play ball in any debt. Okay, so that's where the legal experts go in and help those countries at the same time. But there is an example building, and that to me pushes everybody again towards that model. If the Japanese want to join the Five Eyes, they're clearly an Anglosphere adjacent country with great desire to be part of the bloc. So that's quite big, isn't it? US, Japan, UK, starts to become pretty forceful.
Yeah, it does, Nick. But like specifically, where the question is for India, and I believe that the UK and the EU need to come together and lead that. They need to lead that. They need to invest in the ports. They need to invest in the Indian infrastructure. They have the legal frameworks, as Nick has specified, the common law, and ties to Anglos, right? So they will have the financing, and they have plenty of contacts, right? And the Europeans would benefit from Indian trade deals and infrastructure for generations, getting away from the Chinese. Yeah. So they need to come together and just put their differences aside for the next 3-4 years and just do it.
Yeah, look, and the very fact that I think that, of course, UK is leading. UK, and as Nick mentioned, Quad, Japan, Australia, United States, India, they are in the lead, but I think that the European Union will try to join, at least when it comes to maritime security. These are the very same US-controlled maritime routes that go from Europe, Mediterranean, through the Straits, connecting to the Indian Ocean. Exactly. And this is in the interest of the European Union also to secure these maritime routes, because if the opposite happens, there is no alternative for the European trade, actually. In fact, more than 80% of the European trade goes through this route. So this is in the very same interest. I think that what's going to logically happen is to try to join in terms of military, drills and security cooperation and so on and so forth. And there is actually no argument against it.
I think that was the rationale behind the Lancaster House Treaty between the British and the French, the military treaty.
Yeah, partly. Yeah,
that was.
Yeah, but the French is leading also when it comes to certain security. When it comes to the security agenda, given that we are going to have elections in Germany in September, that means at least for a year, Germany is going to be facing a situation of political reconfiguration. Who is going to be the new chancellor? How the new government is going to be built? It means that Germany is going to be out of the equation, and that means for France the pressure until the election in 2022 to lead the way, because they cannot afford themselves to wait for another year or two to not take decisions in security and defense field. And of course they will try to agree with the British on certain security issues, but the other way is of course also to lead the European Union machinery. So that is, I think, certainly one of the regions, Indo-Pacific. And there is also a question regarding New Zealand, about Quad, and also about the role of New Zealand in the Anglosphere. What is your take about that?
Which one? You want to lead this one?
No, I was leaving that to you.
It's up to you.
I know a lot of Kiwi friends, so...
Oh, well, I don't have Kiwi friends at the moment. I'm probably not going to have a lot of Kiwi friends after this. But my distaste for the leadership in New Zealand is quite clear. I mean, they're trying to sit there and play a cute little game of trying to get away from the United States, being anti-American, because it's been fashionable in New Zealand, let's be honest, for a while now, and try to get into the Chinese sphere, right? Someone must have told
exactly.
Jacinda of how finance actually works and what it means to get away from the dollar, because she did a U-turn, I think it was like 2 weeks ago, Nick. Was it like 2 weeks ago?
Yeah.
She's like, oh no, we want a free trade deal with the United States now all of a sudden, because now
actually,
we know that
she is going on a major tour. This is a country that's isolated itself with COVID. She is going on a major diplomatic tour of the right countries. So somebody,
you know why? You know why, Nick? Because they need the bar, because they've locked down so draconian, right, in New Zealand, which has cut off like 13 or 14% of their GDP specifically to tourism. They need to borrow dollars to get it from the Chinese.
Yeah,
exactly. You can't get it from the Australians because the Australians are tight as it is. So you're gonna have to go to the U.S. Fed for swap lines and borrowing. So that's
exactly. Somebody's had a word in her ear. Because you're right. The U-turn was extraordinary. Maybe the word came from Scott Morrison and the Australians, because they've gone extreme on their pushback against the Chinese. And talking, by the way, just throw this out. I'm throwing this out there for you. Just talking about extreme against the Chinese in that respect. The British are dismantling all the Huawei 5G towers as we speak. All of them. They're coming down.
Yeah.
Yeah, but to be honest, let's highlight that the British, French, German, Belgian, and so on positions were quite similar in 2019, prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, where they didn't see actually the installment and the launch of Huawei 5G networks on European soil as problematic or as linked to security risks. And actually, the COVID-19 pandemic was this eye-opener for the European governments, including the British one, that they actually realized that it might be a serious issue. And I think that this is quite cynical to say, but at least the pandemic brought about something good for Europe, that they actually decided against the launch of 5G
I think the UK
in
were
European.
a little bit ahead because of the Hong Kong pressure. There was antagonism already. I mean, the European Research Group, which was the very pro-Brexit group whilst Theresa May was Prime Minister, transformed itself into the China Research Group, led by, I think, Tom Tugendhat and Ian Duncan Smith. It's interesting. UK has always been very China aware when it's needed to be because of Hong Kong. And I think there was as things were moving on Hong Kong very quickly, that's where the stress point started to break. I agree with you. There was a lot more synergy there. I still have, I'm interested to see now the Greens in Germany are quite anti-China, which is interesting.
Well, they have a MP sitting in the European Parliament who has been very, very critical of China before it was a trend, before it was actually something here in Europe. And I remember experiencing him live in sessions in 2019, where he actually was very vocal about the potential risks coming out from, a closer relationship with China. So I think that, and they're, by the way, not just critical and aware of potential risks coming from China, but also Russia.
Russia as well, yes. I worry that Laschet, because as much as people got excited by the CDU-CSU slump in the opinion polls, things have steadied up a bit. I worry about Laschet. That's my concern. And I think that is a big concern of the French as well, in terms of China and Russia. So that will be interesting to see how that all plays out come the election. Because
and the French are dealing with their own issues right now. Just let me remind you about the 2 letters signed, probably written by generals, pointing to the
active military.
Some of these people were active military personnel and in the highest ranking positions. The second letter was anonymous, and it's quite. I think that
160,000 signatories to date. I've been following that letter very closely because it's quite extraordinary. 2. It gets reflected it will be reflected in the election. Just look at what Barnier said on immigration. Don't think they're unrelated. They're very related. Barnier wants to have immigration control within the EU now. Okay, because it's been proven it's possible because of COVID, with all the borders shut down. So I mean, COVID's got a lot to answer for, I have to say.
More questions. I see more questions coming in the chat room, and I think it's good also to ask these questions. There is one question about Central Asia. What is your take on Central Asia? What kind of role Central Asian countries might play in this global powers competition equation? There is another question about Singapore. Apparently, Singapore is facing once again lockdown situation. What do you think? Do you think that this these re-emerging lockdowns might have actually additional negative impact on any positive global macro outlook scenarios? Let's start with this one.
That's actually a point that me and Nick recently wrote about. Is my view is re-emerging lockdowns because the flu season ramps up, and governments tend to manipulate data. Especially, you're using COVID as a scapegoat is a beautiful thing. So once those flu season numbers ramp up, they could be mixed in with COVID, initiating or justifying another lockdown, like in Singapore and other nations, which would absolutely destroy any kind of economic recovery. And I fully expect that to happen in September. But we would need really good economic numbers up until then to avoid something like that, which I don't think is just going to happen.
I also, interestingly enough, so when the EU withheld the AstraZeneca vaccines to Australia, that gap was filled by a British supply. Yes, I completely concur with Albert, but interestingly enough, I think vaccine diplomacy could work for the Anglosphere. in a positive way, as opposed to vaccine diplomacy has worked quite negatively for the Chinese. You know, even the Chinese equivalent of the CDC is admitting that neither the Sinovac or CoronaVac work very well. And we've got, you know, numerous examples of where Chile had a great vaccination program, 700,000 Pfizer, 10 million Sinovac, and then suffered another big wave. So I actually think, interestingly, from a geopolitical standpoint, the vaccine diplomacy that the US and UK could leverage off of will be quite positive. I am sure there's Singapore will get what it needs from the UK. India sent, for India, the UK with this crisis sent 6 huge aircraft full of oxygen, ventilators, all the emergency equipment that was required. And they were short. And when I say oxygen, this is oxygen makers. So, you know, these were huge lorry-sized oxygen producing machines. 6 of them went to India straight away from the UK. So as much as everybody's been worried about China diplomacy, vaccine diplomacy, I think it's going to flip very dramatically to the benefit of the Western countries.
Oh, I agree. I just worry about variants making the vaccinated people's the vaccines efficiency completely null, and then, you know, like I said, once the flu season starts up again and these numbers start to elevate, that, you know, it'll cause problems.
You've got the perfect lab in the UK. So they're worried about the Indian variant in 4 hotspots right now, and it came out yesterday that they felt that those most exposed are unvaccinated. The vaccines will, if you get the Indian variant, will mitigate the impact. So, you know,
but Nick, one difference is we're in the midst of summer right now, so the flu season is actually lower. Wait till September, and then we'll see what happens.
You know what the talk is in the UK with regard to the flu jab? Given my sister actually had her second AstraZeneca today, apparently the intent is to mix the two. You go for your flu jab, you get an extra shot of the vaccine.
Yeah, and certainly the so-called diplomacy of vaccines will going to further shape the relations between main competitors and also regional actors. We are observing this right now very, very. I mean, the extreme case, of course, with India, as Nick also gave the example, with UK support. I mean, the European Union actually switched on the civil mechanism, and most of the member states actually provided a lot of help as well. But in reality, it's all about now the speed of vaccination. So certainly we are not, the scenario of further lockdowns is still on the table, and it's not only considering Singapore or India, but actually European member states are also quite, behind and need to speed up the vaccination. And if they don't manage this by the end of, I think, summertime, we are facing another lockdown scenario, I suppose, starting with September.
Velina, when have you ever seen a politician take responsibility for any economic or political policies that they've ever pushed out? Never in history. So if the economy doesn't do well, like these jobless numbers, like the actual jobs report came out, was huge miss in the United States, they are going to find a scapegoat, and there is no better scapegoat than COVID. None.
Well,
ever.
Actually, why did the Biden administration come out with this big announcement of no masks are needed if you've been vaccinated on Thursday? Because everything was coming against them. The unemployment, the inflation, the border, all this bad news, they had to give you a bit of good news.
Of course, that's just the way it works.
Yeah, there's your example.
I see that there are more questions coming up in the chat room, so it's up to you to say whether you are actually open to further questions. It's your time. We are already.
Let's take 2 or 3 more. Let's take 2 more.
Well, there is a question, for instance, on Turkey. What is your anticipation about the relation with Turkey under Biden's administration? There is also a question about, or more or less comment about BRI. So there is, for instance, comment that the BRI died in 2017. What is your take? Do you think that China will actually further push for the BRI initiatives, or is this initiative still alive in your view, the Belt and Road Initiative?
So for the Turkey question, because there are two questions. So the Turkey issue, I think that the Biden administration is so weak on foreign policy, specifically in the Middle East, that that Erdogan is going to have to find alternative support, which is going to be Iran, Russia, and to the lesser extent China. Yeah, to the lesser extent China, but for sure it's going to be the Russians and the Iranians that are leading that. I mean, they're the only ones dabbling in the Middle East. Realistically, the United States seems to have been pulling back or just mismanaging everything at the moment. And the worst thing you could do is create instability in the Middle East. You need a firm hand in the Middle East and firm security guarantees. And Turkey is no different. They need that also. And unfortunately, a nervous Turkey is going to cause problems with the Greeks. It's going to cause problems with the Cypriots. It's going to cause problem with Egypt and Italy. And it's a big problem. And I think it's going to be totally mismanaged. And Israel, well, that goes without being said. Israel and Turkey used to be great allies up until Obama came into office. You know, once that destabilized, the Middle East was just waiting to explode. And I know people don't like Trump or Jared Kushner. And realistically, because of the dollar was so strong, the Middle East had to play ball with the United States and Trump. They got these peace deals out there, so they pacified it to a certain degree. But that's just completely done a U-turn right now.
Mm-hmm. Well, they got the peace deals, but they were also vehemently anti-Iran, and that you know, the timing is not a coincidence. I mean, this timing has occurred because of the shift in the administration and the administration's focus on get this deal done with Iran under any cost. So, you know, that dynamic, of course, you're going to see Hamas and Hezbollah step up.
That's such an ignorant and naive ideology. Is like if you appease the Iranians, that the entire Middle East is going to go just to, you know, have flowers and festivals all day long. That's not the case. The Saudis and the Iranians are mortal enemies, right? Qatar and Bahrain, they're mixed up, and the UAE, they're all mixed up and divided across lines, you know, for certain interests between the Iranians and the Saudis. The Israelis and the Saudi Arabians are great allies. People don't understand how great allies they are, and they work against the Iranians. I mean, you cannot appease the Iranians and expect the rest of the Middle East to just go along with it. It doesn't work like that.
Yeah. Nick, there is also a question for you. Do you think that the UK and the European Union will further diverge following the Brexit, or will there be actually some points of intersection?
There should be points of intersection. I don't know when those points of intersection will be activated because I suspect you've got a situation whereby, I mean, I felt that, you know, the AstraZeneca and the vaccine debacle, they shifted blame onto AstraZeneca, but also by default the UK, which was a bit strange. I think the EU, there are fundamental differences. I think there will be divergence on how they treat technology and data. Hence, the UK will push further and faster on AI, which is a weakness for the European Union. But there are natural crossovers, and I think despite the age-long antipathy between the British and the French, there is this key military treaty that cannot be ignored. And as you know, I heard a couple of MPs last week, I got involved in the discussion, were saying we should threaten to pull out of that treaty if the French don't start playing better ball. I think actually all this fishing nonsense, it's all Macron trying to find his feet and position himself prior to the election. He's in quite a weak position because this election coming up next year, if you read between the lines and you speak to people in Paris or in various corridors of power, you may not have So in previous elections, you've had any vote against Le Pen in the second round, a Le Pen, whether it was a father or Marine Le Pen.
Mm-hmm.
This time, if it's Macron versus Le Pen, I'm not convinced that the left-wing voter will vote against Le Pen. They may just abstain, which creates real exposure for Macron. So I think this is all positioning. I don't think it's to do with UK-British relations per se. I think it's all domestic politics driving whatever. So I think ultimately the EU, the problem the EU has is by invoking Article 16 on the vaccine and then Article 122, they're telling companies, particularly multinational companies, if you produce here, you could lose your production to our control, so that you may not be able to fulfill what you agreed with third countries or companies. That is a big problem. That really is a huge problem. So I think that you saw Airbus has shifted a large amount of production to the UK. Airbus, you know that's quite shocking. So I think until that changes and they become more friendly to the rule of law within the supply chain environment, plus the differences in data legislation between the UK and the EU, UK should carry on forging ahead. There will be divergence, but I think the sooner everybody gets over the Brexit sentiment, and the Brexit is, I mean, one thing the European Union should not do is get involved in the Scottish independence debate. Under no circumstances should they be involved with that debate. They will, no doubt there will be some, interference, but it would be a mistake, because if Scotland were to get independence, and I just can't see that happening, then the EU will contribute to Scotland. Scotland will be a net beneficiary. It will not be paying into the budget, it will be taking from the budget. So I think we need a period of cooling down, but they have to sort out the Northern Ireland Protocol. It doesn't work. And that protocol, plus what is effectively a hard border through Article 122, it's a de facto hard border, whereas it was actually a de jure hard border with Article 16, which she quickly withdrew. Until they get that sorted out, that Good Friday peace agreement is problematic. It suffers because of the Northern Ireland Protocol. And I sense that the Biden administration understands that, because they haven't come down hard against the British on that discussion. By the way, Biden, who claims he's the Irish ancestry, that's on his maternal side. His paternal side came from Sussex, which is very English.
Albert,
I just think one quick point. The problem, I think, of why the EU and the UK are likely still to diverge is because the EU cannot allow the perception of leaving the union as a benefit to a nation. This is the problem, because you already have the Dutch and some other nations that are talking about they don't want to have the UK as on a pedestal saying, look what can happen if you leave the European Union. They can't have that. So you're still going to have those political forces attacking the UK for the next 2-3 years, in my opinion.
The trouble is that horse is bolted because of the vaccines. Yeah, even Barney turned around and said, well, one benefit of Brexit was look at the vaccine success of the British.
Yeah.
So, by the way, I'm seeing that I'm seeing that Adam Townsend joined the live stream. Good morning, Adam, and warm greets to United States. It's really great to have you. If he has a question, I will make sure to post it. One question to Albert. Do you think, Albert, we are going to witness a kind of relaxation of the tensions between United States and China under Biden? And do you buy my thesis of the bifurcation of the global system, or is it just it's just a kind of a transitionary period before things calm down once again in favor of the West?
So I do think that Biden is going to be a little bit is he's going to bend to the Chinese for a certain degree, because the Chinese have such asymmetrical economic weapons against the United States, that the Biden administration is going to be forced to, especially around midterms and general election. They're going to have to come out for, settle down with the Chinese a little bit, in my opinion. As to your other point,
bifurcation.
These things happen in cycles, in my opinion, right? You don't have a real threat from the Chinese per se against the West. What the Chinese like to do is they like to plug gaps that the United States or Europe leave in certain areas, and they do that well, right? But in the long run, because of the way the Chinese negotiate and their intent on taking natural resources and food security away from emerging markets, that's inevitably going to fail. And everyone most likely comes back to the Anglosphere and the European Union.
Mm-hmm. There are two questions also on U.S. politics. Do you want to comment on them, Albert? I can ask them very shortly, and you can decide whether you want you have a comment on them. And I have a question also for Nick. One is that, do you think that there are any chance that the audits in Arizona, Michigan, and Wisconsin change the outcome of the election? And the second question is about the Marxist doctrine and the far left indoctrination of certain politicians among the Democrats now moving to schools, universities, intelligence institutions, military. Is it a trend that is only shortly lived, or do you think that this might impact U.S. politics in the long run?
Yeah, of course it'll impact U.S. politics without question. I mean, this is the same as the Soviets did back started from the 60s and 70s by indoctrinating professors, which indoctrinated students, which created, and they amplified civil movements, within the United States to cause problems. This is a normal thing. I mean, most nations meddle in other nations' politics without question. As for U.S. politics, I mean, right now it's all about economics and COVID. Until those two get sorted out, that's what you're going to see for the next 12 to 18 months.
One thing I would say on the this indoctrination, I am a firm believer in the symbiotic relationship politically between the US and the UK in both directions. And what you had in the UK was this split. People are shocked by it, but the Conservative Party is now the party of the working man. And the Labour Party, which went very, very hard left under Jeremy Corbyn, became the party of the urban elites. Mm-hmm. And I think that trend will hit hard starting with the midterms. Because those that knew, but the majority I speak to so many people who voted for Biden who saying, I never knew it was going to be like this. This left me. Never knew. And I'm sitting there going, how could you not?
That's correct, Nick. You're absolutely correct. I mean, the further they go to the left, it's inevitably going to swing back, because now you're starting to hit centrist Democrats with progressive policies that they don't agree with. They're taking jobs away from people. They're canceling people. These are things that they don't sit well with centrists, either on the right or the left. You go too far to the right, it's going to swing to the left. You go too far to the left, it's inevitably going to swing back to the right. So, the danger is that the progressive policies get to the point where they're mixing in with economic policies, which is why I do not want to see Brainard as Fed chair. So that's the biggest danger. But other than that, I mean, it'll swing back and forth like a pendulum. It's just going to take, a decade.
Okay. There is a question. Yeah. Sorry.
Interesting enough, this back and forth like a pendulum. But the swings will get longer. So the anticipation in the UK, the Conservatives have been in power for over 10 years. There is no sign that Labour are going to recover for another 10 years. So that pendulum swing could take a lot longer. And I anticipate that those forces will flow over to the Atlantic in that respect. Like the UK adopts certain American culture, and we're going through the wokest side and cancel culture in the UK at the moment, such that Oxford University wants to get rid of the Sterling measurement system, not understanding that the metric system was introduced by another imperialist, Napoleon. So, I mean, it's nonsense. But I suspect that in the reverse, you will see that pendulum swing go longer. And I just think that this has been such a shock to a lot of people in the US, and how left-wing and progressive people use the term progressive. I'm just going to say these are very, very left-wing policies that have been introduced. Mm-hmm. There'll be pushback, and that pushback will last for a while.
Mm-hmm.
All right,
Nick, because we are approaching the end of this session, but one final question. What about United States establishing a BRI-like initiative in Central and South America? Because this is actually, if we consider the Monroe Doctrine, the near abroad of the United States, now with China and Russia being very active there. How do you think that United States might create some counterbalance to this presence?
You have pro-US countries, but I hate to say this, the majority of the South American countries would push back hard. I mean, there's a lot of anti-US sentiment still incipient in Brazil and Argentina.
Of course, we've neglected Latin America for decades.
Exactly.
Why would they like to? Look at Argentina. Yeah, I mean, we completely ignore them because they're in our backyard. But I mean, it's ridiculous, But this is what I said, that the Europeans need to actually step in with the United States and plug those holes, especially in those overseas networks that they've had historically. It just boggles my mind. But there's no leadership. There's no leadership for such a thing. So I don't see it happening. And I see that the Chinese and the Russians will take advantage of it.
I mean, you have a very anti-US government in Argentina. Brazil's got elections next year, which could be Bolsonaro against Lula. There's two extremes for you. One election, right? So it makes sense, but it makes sense from our perspective. Does it make sense? Is it practical from the local perspective? I don't think so.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I think that there are, of course, questions that we could not cover, but due to the fact that we actually had a session of almost 90 minutes, I think that this is now there was one funny question, which is whether there is one issue that the two of you actually do not agree on.
I don't know whether we can say that publicly, can we?
There's plenty. Sometimes there's plenty on the economic side, plenty on the economic side, and even some disagreement on like what the Germans are going to do in Europe, but we do disagree quite often. We keep it privately.
Let's keep it private. Yes, let's keep it private. And I'm really grateful that you could join me on such a lovely Saturday, and we could actually exchange and discuss so many interesting topics. I reserve myself the option to invite you once again, probably by the end of the year, to cover some of these issues once again and see where we are heading in 2022. And I'm really, really thankful that you found the time to join me today and to discuss so openly with me these topics. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you, Velina. Thank you very much.
Thank you.